Hello and welcome to The Search. I'm Shahei Jurgen. We've come to the final chapter of Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 16. We're going to look just at the first few verses of this chapter in today's study, and then in our next study, we'll finish the chapter and wrap up the book. So we're at an exciting juncture here in our study through the book of 1 Corinthians. Let's begin by reading from 1 Corinthians 16, verses 1 through 4. 1 Corinthians 16, 1 through 4 says, "Now about the collection for the Lord's people, do what I told the Galatian churches to do. On the first day of every week, each one of you should set aside a sum of money in keeping with your income, saving it up, so that when I come, no collections will have to be made. Then, when I arrive, I will give letters of introduction to the men you approve, and send them with your gift to Jerusalem. If it seems advisable for me to go also, they will accompany me." Let's talk about these 4 verses and the collection for the saints that they discuss. You know, philanthropy has a long tradition in both the modern and ancient worlds, but it may be that Israel was the first nation in the world with codified laws concerning charitable giving. According to Easton's Bible Dictionary, Moses established 8 rules governing the treatment of the poor. They include the right of gleaning the fields, the sabbatical year, where a share of the produce of the fields and vineyards was given to the poor. In the year of Jubilee, the poor recovered their property. There's a general command that the rich are to be generous towards the poor. In the sabbatical and Jubilee years, the bondservants were set free. The poor were allowed to share in the feasts. Wages were to be paid at the close of each day, and certain portions from the tithes were assigned to the poor. And that last law concerning tithing is of particular interest. You might know that the word tithe refers to a 1/10 part or portion of something. Israel was to set aside various tithes for prescribed purposes. In Deuteronomy 14, verses 22 and 28, we read, "Set apart a tithe of all the yield of your seed that is brought in yearly from the field, and every 3rd year you shall bring out the full tithe of your produce for that year and store it within your towns." In this chapter, Deuteronomy 14, we see that there are 2 tithes mentioned, one that was annual and one that was collected every 3 years. And the purposes of these tithes really address 2 great needs among the people. One was the financial support of the Levites, whose lives were dedicated to the maintenance and upkeep of the tabernacle and later the Jerusalem temple, and also just a general provision for the poor. So that verse 29 of that same chapter says, "The Levites, because they have no allotment or inheritance with you, as well as the resident aliens, the orphans, and the widows in your town, may come and eat their fill, so that Yahweh your God may bless you in all the work that you undertake." This is the tradition of the Hebrew Bible, and Jesus and his apostles come into the world in that tradition. In fact, Jesus made many attempts to remind people who had means that they have a responsibility to minister to the impoverished in a continuity of the principles of the Old Covenant. For example, Jesus said in Luke 14, "But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, and you will be blessed because they cannot repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous." The Apostle John wrote, "How does God's love abide in anyone who has the world's goods and sees a brother or sister in need and yet refuses help? Little children, let us not love in word or speech, but in deed and truth." 1 John 3, verses 17 and 18. In Matthew 25, Jesus taught that one of the standards of divine judgment will be based on how Christians treat the needy among them. Matthew 25, 31 through 46. So care for the poor, especially among God's people, is of great importance. Additionally, just as God demanded that Israelites reach into their own pockets to aid their needy neighbors, so too the church is called to acts of benevolence by the Lord. And that brings us back to 1 Corinthians 16. Now, at the end of 1 Corinthians 15, when Paul is concluding his lengthy discussion regarding the resurrection of the body, he gives this final admonition to the Corinthians. He tells them to be steadfast, immovable, always excelling in the work of the Lord, because you know that in the Lord your labor is not vain or useless or meaningless. And as he transitioned into the final section of the letter, he's going to quickly touch on one such work, one of those works that are done in the Lord and that are not done in vain. And that is the work of giving. The work of giving. Paul begins 1 Corinthians 16 with his fifth usage of this familiar phrase, now concerning. And that tells us that he's shifting to a new topic. He's responding to something the Corinthians had inquired about with him in a letter they likely wrote to him. We know, of course, that Christians have been engaged in acts of charity from the very beginning of the church age. We can read about that in Acts 2, verses 44 and 45. But the Corinthians evidently had some questions about maybe some of the details, some of the particulars regarding this weekly collection that Paul had arranged. Now, specifically, Paul was looking for relief from the wealthier Christians across the empire for those impoverished believers in Judea. Blomberg outlines the historical setting behind what we're going to read. The collection to which Paul refers in verse 1 formed a major enterprise of his third missionary journey. Significant numbers of Jewish Christians in Jerusalem were impoverished, and Paul spent substantial energy raising funds from various Gentile churches in Asia and Europe to help meet their needs. But in addition to alleviating physical suffering, Paul undoubtedly saw the collection as an opportunity to bring greater unity within the church across Jewish and Gentile boundaries, and to demonstrate the genuineness of Gentile Christianity to skeptical Jewish Christians. Now, we don't know much about the exact nature of the Judean need. We know that this is mentioned in Romans and 2 Corinthians. But 1 Corinthians may be the first book written that addresses this particular situation. And so really, these few verses in 1 Corinthians 16 introduce us to the very concept of the weekly collection. So let's read about them and try to just make some observations about Paul's wording in 1 Corinthians 16, verses 1 through 4. First, verses 1 through 2. Now about the collection for the Lord's people, do what I told the Galatian churches to do. On the first day of every week, each one of you should set aside a sum of money in keeping with your income, saving it up, so that when I come, no collections will have to be made. Now you'll notice, first of all, that these instructions are directed both to the congregation as a whole, as well as, you might say, to individual Christians. We have this language where he says, do what I told the Galatian churches to do. That's a congregational address. And then he pivots to saying, each one of you, so more of an individual focus. Now, we have noticed earlier in 1 Corinthians that when Paul brings up churches, he is referring to congregational assemblies, when you gather together as the church, we read in 1 Corinthians 14, for example. He often will also mention churches in a sense of pointing to the universal practice of all faithful congregations. We've seen this at least 4 times where Paul is imploring the Corinthians to do something based on the fact that this is what everyone does. And these instructions here are no different. Corinth needed to do what the Galatian congregations were already doing. So the collection is a congregational activity. In fact, one of the words Paul will later use to describe this work is the word fellowship, koinonia, sometimes translated as sharing. In Romans 15, 25 and 26, it says, at present, however, I'm going to Jerusalem in a ministry to the saints. For Macedonia and Achaia were pleased to share their resources with the poor among the saints at Jerusalem. This is important. It's just like the Lord's Supper. The collection is a sharing. It's an activity that Christians participate in together. And so all congregations must take up the collection. But of course, Paul said there's also something quite individual about this work. On the first day of every week, each one of you should set aside a sum of money. Giving is the responsibility of every disciple. Reese provides this comment. He says, let each one embrace this opportunity and privilege to give, the poor as well as the rich, were expected to contribute according to their ability. The slave, as well as the master, was expected to give. Each person in each congregation is encouraged to become involved in sharing in this collection. We even learn something here about the timing and occasion for this giving. Paul says it's done on the first day of the week. Now, the first day of the week is how the King James and New King James versions render this expression, but most of the modern English versions, including the NASB, the ESV, the NIV, the NCV, they all say on the first day of every week. The Common English version says each Sunday. So the collection was to be taken every first day of the week. And that makes sense because that's when ancient Christians assembled, according to examples like in Acts 20 and verse 7. A congregational activity must be done by necessity when the congregation comes together. And the testimony of the New Testament is that congregations assembled regularly on Sunday, likely in honor of the day Christ rose from the dead. Ciampa and Rossner note, the mention of the first day of every week, along with the purpose that when I come no collections will have to be made, suggests that the setting aside of money would not be just the setting apart within one's own possessions, but the setting aside of the money by presenting it to the leaders of the church. This was not something that was just done privately or individually. It was done as the congregation assembled together every first day of the week. The apostle described the collection as something which is saved up, or the ESV says stored up. Putting something aside refers to the weekly giving, and storing it up implies a repository of some type, where the money is kept until it's needed. As the Living Oracles translates, according as he may have prospered, putting it into the treasury. So, each congregation is given instructions to collect and store funds. And I think we can all identify that there's a lot of wisdom in a system like this. Needs may arise with little to no warning. A Christian may suddenly become ill and need help with emergency doctor's bills. A family could lose their house in a fire. A natural disaster could cause widespread havoc and destruction that impacts many people. When sudden needs arise, of course, it may be difficult to contact all the congregation and begin a process of collecting funds. And so a church treasury alleviates this potential problem. Now, Paul also instructed Christians about how to prepare for the collection. He says that each one should give as he may prosper, the New King James Version says. The word prosper means to be successful in acquiring profit or gain, like to gain in business or to gain by doing work. In other words, just means to make money. God expects Christians to give proportionally to what they profit. Remember, under the Mosaic system, the proportion was stipulated at 10% with the tithe. And although no such percentage is demanded by Paul, I think that there are some principles from the New Testament that we can consider when we think about how we should be guided in our own giving. For example, on one occasion, Jesus illustrated his departure from the world by comparing two kinds of servants. One servant would be faithful in executing his Lord's will during his absence, while the other may think, oh, the master has delayed his return, and so he gives himself to immorality, thinking the master is not going to come back anytime soon. Jesus described the severe punishment the rebellious servant would receive because he knew better than to act in such an untoward way. And so Jesus concludes that little analogy, that little story, that little illustration with this principle in Luke 12:48. From everyone to whom much has been given, much will be required. And the one to whom much has been entrusted, even more will be demanded. The Israelites under the Old Covenant lived primarily in an agrarian society. Most of their livelihood depended on good harvests, which of course can fluctuate from year to year. These were not the kind of people who walked around with disposable income. Yet even of them, the Lord required at least 10%, and beyond that, Israel was encouraged to give free will offerings. And so we might ask ourselves, those of us who live in the modern West, in countries that are beyond wealthy, we might ask ourselves, how much more will God expect of us, people who don't worry about where our next meal is coming from because we know that our pantries are overflowing with food? So this is the general principle that may lay behind our attitude towards giving. And now Paul turns to the exact situation that his needy brethren in Judea were facing in verses 3 and 4. Then he says, "When I arrive, I'll give letters of introduction to the men you approve and send them with your gift to Jerusalem. If it seems advisable for me to go also, they will accompany me." Schreiner helps to explain why Paul requested these representatives from Corinth to escort their funds to Jerusalem. When Paul arrives in Corinth, he will provide the necessary letters of introduction to those who are approved to bring the gift to Jerusalem. Paul does not appoint the men who are to carry the gift to Jerusalem, but he trusts the Corinthians to choose men of integrity and good reputation to bring the gift. We know from 2 Corinthians 8 that Paul was concerned about the men who would bring the gift to Jerusalem, since religious hucksters often absconded with money. It was imperative then that men of the highest character should transport the gift, and the gift must not be sent via only one person. Thus for Paul, two truths were important: that the Corinthians helped those needy saints in Jerusalem, and that everything ought to be done in a transparent way. The collection is certainly a command, but Christian giving should always be motivated by love and generosity. 5 times in the book of Deuteronomy, God said, "Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt," as a qualifier for some instruction he was about to deliver to the people, like how they were to treat servants, how they were to provide for widows and orphans, and how they were to care for the poor. Throughout the book of Deuteronomy, God was essentially saying, "You do for others what I have done for you." Another powerful principle that stands behind our attitude towards benevolence. The collection for the saints is no different than those statements in the book of Deuteronomy. God's grace to his children has abounded in more ways than any Christian could attempt to quantify. What believers could deny the generous favor God has shown them? Rather than thinking about deliverance from Egypt, those who belong to Christ should remember that all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, but also that we have been justified freely by his grace through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus. Romans 3:23 and 24. If God has shown us grace, and surely he has, then we should go out and be like God by showing grace to others. So, as we've made some observations about the text, and as we've understood a little bit about the background of Paul's instructions in 1 Corinthians 16, 1 through 4, I think we can make this conclusion. Every Christian, in conjunction with their congregation and at their regular Sunday assembly, is instructed to set aside a portion of income that goes into the treasury for needy saints. And we conclude that since God has blessed his people, they ought to be inspired to bless others in return, so that we may live in the light of our blessed Redeemer, that we may shine unto others the light of God's glorious gospel that has been so brightly shown unto us. Now, we've come a long way, and we're almost through the book of 1 Corinthians. So we invite you to come back next time as we conclude our study of 1 Corinthians 16 and wrap up our study of this incredible epistle the Apostle Paul wrote to the Corinthian church so long ago. Until then, God bless you.